So there are reports that as many as 40 to 50% of the horses in the US and in Europe would be classified as overweight. So I think it also becomes sort of a matter of like, if this is what you see, right? If you never see what our little gold standard body condition score 5 is, you don't even know what that looks like. And so seeing a lean animal, a lot of people are like, oh, he's too thin. It really is that we just don't know what correct is. And so I think that's a big part of the problem.
Hello, and welcome to another equine-focused episode of the Pet Food Science Podcast, where we dive into the science, trends, and innovations shaping the way we feed our horses. I'm your host, Dr. Alex Rankovich, and today we're joined by our guest, Dr. Kris Hiney, to discuss the topic of obesity and insulin dysregulation. Dr. Hiney is an associate professor and equine extension specialist at Oklahoma State University. She obtained her Ph.D. in animal sciences from Michigan State University and has since dedicated her career to equine nutrition, reproduction, health, and management. Thank you so much, Dr. Hiney, for joining us today, and welcome. It's so great to have you.
Okay, I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
Of course. So I know I gave a little brief introduction about who you are to our audience, but would you mind further introducing yourself and giving us some more background into who you are and what led you down the path to where you are today?
Sure. So, I am the equine extension specialist for Oklahoma State University. So I do both adult and youth education throughout the state. So pretty involved on the teaching, not in the college setting, but I also worked in undergraduate education for 12 years before I came here. Background, where I originally went to school, was doing more exercise physiology with a heavy dose of nutrition. And then since I had to teach just about everything, had to become a little bit more of a jack of all trades. And now what I'm really interested in is kind of horse behavior welfare and how we interact with them. So that's kind of me in a nutshell.
That's perfect. And I think your sort of insight into the public and doing that education with them will bring a bit of a different spin, I think, on our conversation. And it's definitely something I want to pick your brain on a bit more as we sort of end our conversation today, too. So we're going to talk about obesity and insulin dysregulation today. And so a lot of our audience might be familiar with obesity in terms of dogs and cats, because we do a lot of episodes on obesity related to dogs and cats, of course, because, it's no surprise that we do have a lot of chunky pets out there. But would you mind discussing how big of an issue obesity is when it comes to the horse population and why we should care about it?
Yeah. So just like dogs and cats, I think people find it so much easier to recognize a thin animal as a malnutrition problem. And we don't really recognize the opposite quite so much. So one way they kind of interrelate, right? Because if you're used to sort of seeing pudgier cats and dogs, then you're probably used to seeing it in horses as well. So there are reports that as many as 40 to 50% of the horses in the US and in Europe would be classified as overweight. So I think it also becomes sort of a matter of like, if this is what you see, right? If you never see what our little gold standard body condition score 5 is, then like you don't even know what that looks like. And so seeing a lean animal, a lot of people are like, oh, he's too thin.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, it really is that we just don't know what correct is. And so I think that's a big part of the problem. There's a lot else going into it that I'm sure we'll talk about. But again, I don't think the average owner is even used to seeing what a 5 or heaven forbid a 4 is in a horse.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with you. I mean, discussing horses, I know that there's studies that have, put down on paper, owners absolutely will underestimate the body condition score of their horses. And we have the same things in dogs and cats. And I always like to use the example of golden retrievers. I'm not sure that anyone's ever seen a lean golden retriever, or very rarely do they. And it's almost shocking to them, I think, when they do. So yeah, it's certainly the same for our horses, and definitely I think certain populations like our ponies, or if you look at our hunter horses, right? I don't know how many of them are actually of normal weight or body condition, or could even be considered lean. So we're also going to discuss insulin dysregulation today. And would you, maybe before we get into that, just describe what that term really means and what that captures for our audience members who might not be familiar?
Yeah, and it probably just because we tend to change terms a lot. I'm kind of laughing, we now have equine asthma, and it's been everything under the sun. Like, it's been renamed so many times since I started in academia. And I think insulin dysregulation is kind of like that, because we used to call it insulin resistance. And now they've just changed the terminology a little bit. So if listeners are more familiar with insulin resistance and think about from a human standpoint, think about it that way. So essentially it is, you think about it kind of like type 2 diabetes. I guess that's probably the easiest way for most people to think about it, because it's not that these horses don't produce insulin, right? And in fact, it's actually typically they would be hyperinsulinemic, right? So they secrete too much insulin. And that's because the body is not, insulin isn't doing its job, right? And so the horse has to secrete more and more to try to bring blood glucose back down. So that's what we would be seeing again in kind of more of that type 2 human model. So don't think about it as this is a diabetic horse that can't produce insulin. They just produce too much in response to that stimuli of what's being absorbed out of the GI tract.
And so I think for our listeners who may not be able to connect why we're discussing obesity and insulin dysregulation, could you speak to that a little bit? Why do we sort of talk about one and the other usually hand in hand?
Yeah, I mean, again, I always like to refer back to the human model quite a bit, because I think it's easier to understand, right?
Absolutely.
And so just as obesity in humans is a risk factor for type 2 diabetes, the similar thing is true for horses. And so there is a genetic component to it. So if we think about, it's a little bit of a chicken and an egg here, right? So who do we see the most insulin resistance in? Well, the breeds that are more predisposed to obesity. So those horses that have that more thrifty genotype are going to be a little bit more susceptible. So that's where, when we think about our ponies and, Morgans, Pasafinos, et cetera, they have that genetic tendency to have those issues. Now, you could also, play the game, well, why do they have obesity as an issue? I think we've also learned that their internal stimulation to eat, right? So they don't get obese on their own, right? So these horses often will consume more. So if we're feeding them ad libitum or grazing them on pasture, a lot of times these horses are just going to eat more than maybe some of their lean or more normal body type cousins. And so, yeah, it's not always just, what we have available to them, but simply they're consuming more if given the opportunity. And in these guys, they have more of this hyperinsulinemic response to what they're consuming.
Absolutely. And I think you sort of touched on a little bit, but, sometimes you have an obese horse that doesn't have any issues with insulin dysregulation. And sometimes you have a horse that has insulin dysregulation, but isn't obese, right? So it doesn't, one doesn't always mean the other. And so we do have these different kind of groups of horses as well.
Yeah. So definitely phenotype is not going to predict what's going on hormonally or metabolically. And so we do, obviously if your horse fits the phenotype and is obese and has some of those morphological characteristics of holding fat in the wrong place, then those horses are going to be more at risk. And so we want to keep a little bit closer track of them. But if you have a horse that falls into the breed category that are more likely to have issues, we encourage owners to maybe start checking in maybe a little bit sooner, and maybe those, annual wellness visit might have a blood test in it to see, hey, what is actually my horse's normal insulin levels, just to kind of give us a little heads up if some of these guys are tipping into that disease state.
Yeah, and I think to that point too, do you usually have any sort of signs that you have owners look for to kind of gauge whether their horse might have some abnormal insulin function?
Yeah, it's usually that phenotype of the crusty neck. So we think about ponies, especially. Boy, they just lay down that adipose on the top of the neck so much. But also, you might see more abdominal fat, more in the inguinal area, and so the difference. And again, we can use that human model, right? So humans can carry fat in a good way or in a bad way, and so it depends on where you're carrying that fat, that may be a little bit more predictor of what's going on.
I think everyone's generally, kind of familiar with obesity and diabetes in humans. So going back to that and sort of making that connections, I think for owners that you're right, maybe aren't quite as knowledgeable when it comes to their horses is a really great way to help them put two and two together. So when you're talking to owners and they have these horses, whether you have maybe a horse that's obese and has insulin dysfunction, or you have an obese horse without insulin dysfunction, or a lean horse with insulin dysfunction, how do you talk to them about management? How do you manage these different types of horses differently?
So I think with horses, this is so much harder. And so I always think, I kind of laugh because to me in competing animals, right, I just don't feed them. And then that takes care of it, right? I portion control. Here you go. This is your food.
And you can control what they're eating. I give them this kibble and that's all I'm feeding them really. And I can control how much I give them.
Yeah, I'm always like, it's so simple. But with horses, it's so much harder. And the reason that, so think about our dogs and our cats are meal feeders, right? So they do fine with food once a day, twice a day. Horses are not built like that at all. So because they're a grazing animal, right, they have that behavioral need, that physiological need to have that continual food input, right? So they're going to be driven to consume food for the majority of the day. And if we don't do that, we have so many issues if we actually restrict feed in horses. So and that's what's so hard for owners, because we're on one hand, we're saying, hey, your horse needs continual access to forage. And on the other hand, we're saying, oh, by the way, but don't get them fat. Like, what message do you want us to follow? Yeah. So you have to be creative. And unfortunately, sometimes you have to get horses to lose weight so heavily do diet restriction that, again, we might be messing up the GI tract and making that unhealthy. And I guarantee you're messing with their brain, right? Because again, a horse that's feed restricted is going to be super, super unhappy. They can develop a lot of stereotypies, stress, etc. So it becomes a trick for owners to reduce caloric intake while trying to keep the horse mentally and physiologically healthy. So to me, it's such a more complicated story than just, hey, I'm going to give you low-cal kibble, or I'm going to give you 3/4 of a cup instead of one.
And so do you have any tips then? How do you sort of mitigate some of those risks when it comes to, the potential negative consequences, not only on the GI health, but also when it comes to behavior and that overall welfare of that animal and trying to balance that scale, I guess?
Yeah, there's quite a few recommendations that we can make. And so for owners, we always try to, at least making one change is better than no
Absolutely.
change. So one of the great tools that has come along are the slow feeder hay nets, or there's a number of different devices on the market these days that are essentially make the horse have to work a little bit harder to get their hay. And so that has been shown, we have research that it prolongs the feeding time. Mm-hmm. And so then even if we are restricting, right? So and I don't recommend ad libitum forage for an obese horse, right? So we got to restrict intake, but now we've at least extended the feeding time. So that's a very, very useful tool. The other one that is often more challenging for owners is trying to find more well, I guess less calorically dense hay. But unfortunately, if you're a hay producer, right, my job is to produce the best quality hay that is of most value for other horse owners. So trying to source low calorie hay, which is typically more mature hay, is often hard because no hay producer in the country is trying to make low calorie hay. They just don't.
Absolutely. And just storage, right? Like some people just don't have the ability to store multiple types of hay. If you have a barn full of horses and it becomes a really just a challenge from a practical point of view too.
Yeah, it's really, really hard. And so many of our horse owners, maybe their horse is boarded. So you don't even have a choice really in what forage is fed. And so it is a much more complicated issue a lot of times in just what the base of that animal's diet should be and how we try to manage it. So that's where we go with, okay, well, maybe we'll have to reduce the volume, but we got to figure out a way to slow down intake. And so those are generally our go-tos. The other one that horse owners do not want to hear, and I get it, right? I sympathize, I'm with you, is we have to restrict pasture intake because pasture is going to be much more nutrient dense. And especially, our insulin dysregulated horses, certain pastures will kick up insulin too high, different times a year, different times of the day. Like it gets to start to be very confusing or complicated. And so oftentimes the recommendation is to not give them access, dry lot them. And that's such a hard message. If you're telling horse owners that their horses shouldn't eat grass, and this is what they're designed to do, right?
Well, absolutely, right? You Google an image of a horse and it's going to be a horse out on pasture, right? It's like they just go hand in hand.
It's just hard. And we're asking them to not allow the horse to do what they really, really want to do. So I always think this is a fun story to share. So sometimes what we'll do is say, okay, well, we'll just limit the amount of time they're on pasture so that maybe the horse doesn't get 24 hours. Maybe they'll get 12, 6, however. But there's a fun study out there, and I don't remember the authors, and I'm probably bad for not sharing that. But ponies, like if you do pasture restriction, they're like, okay, how many hours do I have to eat? And they just eat more, right? They're like 4 hours, I've got this. And so it's really hard sometimes because they do, right? When you restrict access, they just gobble it up faster when you turn them out. So again, it can be pretty challenging if you're trying to allow them some pasture and still keep intake low.
Yeah, and I know the conversation sort of remains the same too. We're thinking about grazing muzzles because a lot of people don't, they don't feel comfortable or they just don't think it's right for their horse to be outside with a grazing muzzle all the time. But same thing, you take it off and they just make up for the amount that they hadn't eaten before and just gorge themselves essentially.
You're right on the grazing muzzles. That's the other one that we often recommend, but you've got to find one that works for your horse. And there was another fun study where they put grazing muzzles on ponies. Some ponies just get so mad about wearing the grazing muzzle, like it's not even worth it. Some of them try so hard to chew through it that they end up making the hole bigger. And so you have to replace them more frequently because the pony's like, I can do this, right? So you really have to watch what's happening because if you didn't notice that your pony actually enlarged the hole so he can still eat as much as he wants, I just think they're funny. They're wonderful little animals that.
Oh yeah, they're smart, but
they'll get around you every turn.
Yeah, we had Dr. Pat Harris on the podcast, and I liked what she said. She's like, ponies don't read textbooks. Although we say that horses should eat this much % of their body weight in dry matter, the ponies don't care. Like they're going to eat more than that if they can. So I always thought it was great that although we have, a lot of this stuff written down in theory, the ponies just will do whatever they want. And
I think it was Dr. Harris that did that study with putting the grazing muzzle.
Yeah,
on
I think
ponies.
so too.
And I just loved even how they wrote the discussion that the ponies were angry and they dug holes in the pasture because they were so mad about wearing their grazing muzzles. So yeah, you got to figure out what works for your horse. Definitely.
Absolutely. And so when it comes to managing these horses, are those sort of the most common mistakes that you typically see is people trying to sort of find this middle ground to what they think is some kind of restriction that sort of does have this negative consequence or this the horses essentially just don't respond to the compromise that they're trying to make.
Yeah, and I think in general, because you're going to end up seeing the horse being so frustrated and unhappy, it's hard to keep with it. We did a little project at the other university I worked at, where we were trying to do some weight loss and some different interventions with hay restriction or exercise. And one of my friends let me use their horse on the study, and I gave her back a cribber because they were so unhappy with the food restriction that horse developed a stereotypy. So like there's real consequences sometimes to withdrawing hay. And so I think horse owners, if you have the choice over, okay, am I going to deal with a horse that's overweight or have my horse being really upset and angry? I get it why they're going to lean more towards like, well, maybe I'll just not know that this other problem is happening.
And how often does the discussion sort of include exercise? Because, for some people, if they're boarding their horse, maybe they don't have too much of a say in what they can change in terms of that horse's diet. But, in theory, they can try and increase that exercise and increase that energy expenditure. How do you find that owners typically respond to that?
I mean, there's the other part of it, right? Because if you are already really exercising your horse, you probably don't have an obese horse. So now we're asking people to also schedule more time out of their day to institute an exercise program. And certainly if you have an insulin dysregulated horse, then you have the other issue of, well, they may have laminitis, and clearly then that's off the table, right? We're not going to ask a painful horse to move. But I think even though exercise has been proven, we know that from the humans, right? Right. So even dogs and cats, get them to move more. That will help if we increase energy expenditure. But I think it just is hard. It's hard for people to add that into their day. Am I going to go ride the horse? I mean, literally think about how much more time it takes to often drive to where the horse is, tack them up, do all the things, and ride them or even lunge them. It's a lot easier to go play ball in the backyard than it is to exercise your horse. So I often think it becomes more of an issue with time for our owners, because we know most of our owners are, college educated women. They've got jobs, right? We got stuff to do. Where am I going to fit in trying to get the pounds off my fat horse? Or pony, right? Because oftentimes it's pony. So what are you going to do with that pony? You going to go chase him around? Right? So,
yeah, of course. Yeah.
It's really hard.
No, I agree with you 100%. And I know, I think it's from some of the research that Dr. Harris has published as well. I think the recommendation is like about a half hour of canter work. Like it has to be a certain amount of exercise that gets their heart rate above a certain point. And if you have a pony or a horse who hasn't seen exercise in years, then even trying to get them to that point and getting them to do that work is going to be a challenge too.
Right. And I love, because they're doing great work and so all the research teams that are out there, but I'm always say like, I'm on the front lines, right?
Absolutely.
So I do the owner workshop and then they look at you and they're like, no, I'm not doing that. Okay,
yeah, you have to consider the practicality. Yeah, absolutely. And so I know you have done a bit of research looking at young growing horses and some research looking at bone development. When we're looking at young horses that are overweight or obese, how does that affect their development and their future health?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't think anybody has honestly followed them longitudinally. We do know certainly with developmental orthopedic diseases and, our flexural limb deformities, OCDs, things like that we want to avoid that too fat of a horse when they're young, right? So we advise that they're lean as they're young as well. I don't think we've done anything with looking at, okay, we've got weanlings or yearlings or 2-year-olds that are obese and then following them long term. We just don't do that. It's not like we have a golden retriever lifetime study for horses. We should,
one day,
but we don't, right? So the best we can do is to advise people to avoid overfeeding those horses. Well, here's the problem. That a lot of times we're producing young horses that are going to go on to show or be sold. And we know There's data on that too, that judges select animals at higher body condition score, as well as at auction. So if I'm trying to prep a horse to sell it, then financially, right, it's in my best interest to have that horse a little overweight. So again, the economics and the industry reality is sort of counter to what we would say these are the best practices for the health and longevity.
No, you touched on a great point, and that's something that really irks me. I have a young horse, and when she was 3, I was like, oh, maybe I'll enter her. Like, she's a beautiful Hanoverian. I'll enter her in some conformation classes, line classes. Went to kind of check them out when she was younger, and it was all horses that are overweight and obese. And all those horses, the really, really fat ones, were the ones that were winning and doing well. And I was just like, I'm not willing to do that. I'm not willing to put her at that body condition score just for a couple classes. And so, yeah, I didn't end up following through with it. But if I was an owner who, maybe didn't know the other side of things, then yeah, like I would look at those horses and absolutely think that's what my horse should look like. Because these are the horses that you're saying have great conformation and, what we should be breeding for and selecting for. And I think that's a really tough thing to wrap your head around.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, you could kind of go back to the companion animals and the bench dogs the same way, right? So often the conformation ones are a little more plush, right, than our working animals are. And yeah, judges train people to feed them more because that's what they're selecting.
So this actually leads me into another question. I think you have really good insight on this as someone who, like you said, is on the front lines. So you created a lot of educational resources. You talk to the public. You just have a really good sense of the research side and then the practicality of it too. Do you have any insights into the best ways that nutritionists can educate horse owners and judges and have these conversations, especially on things like obesity in young horses that might have welfare implications?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one thing we do know, because we've done some surveys, myself with a graduate student and then some other people, that honestly, horse owners are getting most of their nutritional information. They get it from their veterinarian. So I think that veterinarian education as well, like in vet school, of this is a healthy body condition score, and actually trying to make that part of that, those wellness conversations, that really we need to address that earlier, because a lot of horse owners honestly don't come to, Ph.D. nutritionists or extension people. We would like them to, but mostly people are going to listen to their veterinarian or their horse trainer or people in their barn. Like, we have that data. And so I think that maybe more really focusing on, again, our early vet students and continuing education in that field may help quite a bit. But again, it's trying to increase owner awareness and almost convincing them that this overweight horse does potentially have some problems down the road. And so I think it's almost a culture shift, which I don't think is any different from companion animals, right? So there's a lot that goes into getting people to change their behavior than just knowledge. And that's the field we're working in right now, right? You have to also have motivation to change, the opportunity to change, right? There's a whole lot more that goes into changing human behavior than just, I might know something. And so I think it's actually a pretty complex field when we're asking owners to change their behavior. And I believe they've done some of that work too in companion animals. How do you get the owner to change their practices? And I don't think it's any dissimilar.
Mm-hmm. I think more and more universities, at least here in Ontario at the Ontario Veterinary College, we have people that focus on veterinary communication. And so I think a lot of that is really starting to cover ground in companion animal with, what's the best way to have these conversations? What's the best terminology to use? What are the best things that owners respond to? But to your point, it'd be great to see some of that kind of spill over into horse veterinary medicine and horse nutrition as well, and understand, is it the same? Do we have to treat things differently? I also like that you mentioned that recent paper, because I did read that paper and I thought it was really interesting that a lot of horse veterinarians they weren't very confident in their own nutrition knowledge, especially the ones coming out of school. But then I think they listed other veterinarians as their top resource for nutrition in addition to PhDs. So I was just sort of wondering, what's the best way to sort of bridge that gap if veterinarians don't think that they're very knowledgeable, but they're also going to other veterinarians to get that knowledge?
Right. I mean, my answer is you start putting more nutrition education in the curriculum, but they're already so packed, right? So, it's one of those questions of what do you take out in order to add? So I think maybe having more continuing education available, maybe more certification type things. So I am a veterinarian that is also certified. I'm making stuff up now. This is my wish list, right? Of I can test and verify that I have additional expertise in nutrition. And certainly having more opportunities. And they do this, right? So they do a good job of bringing PhD nutritionists to some of, the American Association of Equine Practitioners and worldwide to try to get more of that crosstalk conversation. But again, not every veterinarian goes to those, big national conferences. And so that would be my little suggestion, if anybody wants to take it, is having maybe some of those continuing ed and further certifications that can be part of their business practice, right? I have this certification license, whatever maybe we're going to call it, that says I have an additional depth of expertise in nutrition.
No, it's great. I completely agree with you that I don't know what the answer is, but I think something like that sounds like it could work. So hopefully someone listens to this podcast and they take that away and then they give you the credit that you deserve for coming up with that idea.
Yeah, there you go.
No, it's great. I really appreciate all your insight today. And I think too, it's one thing to have the research and to have this knowledge, but it's also about getting it into the hands of people that actually need it and that are going to make these changes to their horses and, giving them that knowledge and that advice in a really practical way too. So I really, really appreciate you sharing all of that.
It's time for our famous three.
Wisenetics turns podcast airtime into brand authority. We don't sell ads, we elevate voices. Curious how far your voice can go to become a reference in the industry and attract more leads? Scan the QR code and discover how we can turn your expertise into unmatched brand authority. Let's transform expertise into influence, starting now.
So we're going to let you go soon, but before we wrap up, we like to end with a few fun questions to sort of allow the listeners to get to know you a bit better. So the first question that I always ask, which I have a lot of fun listening to the answers, is if you could own any horse, real, fictional, living, not living, who would it be and why?
Oh, if I could own any real horse.
Or it doesn't have to be real. It could be a horse in movies, cartoons, could be, I had someone say unicorn once. So it could be anything. The options are endless.
Okay. I'm going to go back from me being a kid. I loved all of the Walter Farley series. So yeah, definitely the Black Stallion. Like I always even imagined that I owned him. So
that's a great answer.
I love those series of books. So.
No, it's great. I love that. I feel like every little girl, especially if you're like, a horse loving girl growing up, you have that one horse that you just kind of picture one day that you'll own. So for me, it was Spirit. I really loved Spirit. So I resonate with that one. Second question, do you have any resources that you recommend for anyone wanting to learn more about equine nutrition or management, whether it's specific to obesity or just generally?
Well, definitely, I'm going to give a shout out to all of my fellow colleagues. So I am a member of Extension Horses. So we are a nationwide group of extension specialists. And so we do produce quite a bit of curriculum for essentially online education, whether they're smaller articles or online courses or anything like that. So they're a great resource because it's extension and it's written to be accessible to the horse owner. And we have such a good network of people across the country that, if I need to know about things going on in the Northwest, I know somebody to call. And again, I love them. They're a great group of people that have been really helpful and very passionate about helping horse owners throughout the country.
Perfect. I love that. And we'll hopefully maybe get more of them on the podcast too. And then my last question sort of really relates to what you just said, but in your role as an extension specialist, what do you find to be the biggest challenge when you're trying to translate equine nutrition research or research related to equine management or behavior into real world application?
Yeah, I think because especially with horses, there's such this more like historical knowledge, myth, culture of how we do things that I think it takes a while to change. And I believe, this is maybe my own personal theory, right? A lot of the original horse research and everything we were doing wasn't maybe focused on the largest population of horses that we have, which is recreational horse owners. And I think maybe that's why you're seeing more now on obesity and, some of these other issues, because what we did for so long was focused on a different type of horse and more the commercial or competitive horse industry. And we just know that most horses, that's not what they do, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And, horses are living so much longer too, that I think we need to do a lot more working on these geriatric horses and owning horses for long periods of time, looking at longitudinal studies, right? Just the whole, what happens when they're obese, when they're young. We don't know, right? And horses change hands so many more times and they live so much longer. I just think there's so much more we need to know to really provide great guidance for the long term for horse health.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I really like your insight into looking at essentially what is our biggest population, which is the horses that, aren't performing at these high levels. They're companion animals, right? And, we love them. We want to care for them. And that means doing this research to really understand how we can support them throughout their lifespan and long term. So that's great. Thank you so much, Dr. Hiney, for joining us today, for sharing your time, your expertise. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast and learning from you. I know our listeners will take away a lot from the discussion and hopefully change a little bit on how they manage their horses at home as well, and maybe take a more critical look at the body condition of their horse as well. That's hopefully something that we can kind of encourage with this episode too. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you to all our listeners who are tuning in. And please don't forget to subscribe and stay up to date on our future episodes. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.